ever get that feeling? Like, you really want to understand some of these big philosophical ideas, but, without having to read, like, a whole library first.
Yeah, totally. Sometimes you just want to cut to the chase.
Well, that's exactly what we're going to do today.
Yep, a real deep dive.
Into the thought of this maybe not so well-known 16th century German philosopher, a guy named Nicolaus Taurellus.
Yeah, he's a bit of a hidden gem.
Yeah.
Not exactly a household name.
But trust me on this, he's got these ideas that are, well, pretty wild, actually.
Yeah, especially if you're into metaphysics, like thinking about the nature of reality and stuff.
Right, like what's the world really made of? Those kinds of questions.
And how does that connect to, well, God, creation, the whole shebang?
Okay, so Taurellus, he was a Lutheran, right?
Yeah, he was working within that whole Lutheran tradition, post-Reformation and all that.
But he was trying to do this huge thing.
Oh, yeah, he was super ambitious.
Like trying to put together philosophy, reason, with the truths of theology.
You'd think that'd be a pretty straightforward harmony, right? But not so much for Taurellus.
Definitely not. Like, in trying to make them fit, he came up with some pretty out there metaphysical ideas.
Seriously out there.
The kind of stuff that honestly can make you rethink like everything you thought you knew about reality, basically.
Big time.
And that's exactly why we're diving deep into his work today.
Yeah, let's get into the nitty-gritty.
Specifically, his immaterialist metaphysics.
Which is, like, way more radical than it might sound at first.
So we're going to really unpack this, right? Like, how did he argue against the traditional view of matter, like stuff?
Yeah, what did he think the world was made of, if not matter?
And then we're going to get into his ideas about substance and, how things are put together, composition.
And, of course, what all this means for how we understand, well, everything. From the world around us to, like, us human beings.
Right. The whole enchilada. And just as a little teaser here, some of his stuff actually kind of foreshadows later thinkers, like big names, Leibniz, for example.
It's true. He's like a missing link almost in the history of like early modern philosophy.
Totally. And for this deep dive, we're mainly relying on this really thorough entry on Nicolaus Taurellus from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
It's an excellent resource, really well researched.
All right. So let's get down to brass tacks. Who was this guy, this Nicolaus Taurellus? What was going on in the philosophical world when he was around?
All right. So Taurellus, he was born back in 1547 in this place called Montbéliard.
Montbéliard?
Yeah, and at the time it was politically tied to the Duchy of Württemberg.
Oh, okay.
And get this, he actually got patronage from the Duke.
Fancy.
Which allowed him to go study at the University of Tübingen.
Tübingen? Wasn't that a pretty important place back then for, like, intellectual stuff?
Oh, yeah, a major center in the 16th century. And while he was there, he got to study philosophy under this really well-known Aristotelian scholar named Jacob Scheck.
I think I've heard that name somewhere.
Yeah, he was a big deal, known for his work on logic, natural philosophy.
So Taurellus started out with a pretty solid grounding in, like, the whole Aristotelian tradition then, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And Tübingen at the time was, like, buzzing with all sorts of different interpretations of Aristotle. It was a super lively intellectual scene.
So how did he go from, like, pure Aristotelian philosophy to, well, all this wild stuff about immaterialism and stuff?
So he got his master's in philosophy in 1565, and then at first he kind of switched gears, went into theology.
Theology.
Yeah. But then, Taurellus, he was always a curious guy, so he ended up going in yet another direction, medicine.
Wow, a real Renaissance man.
Totally. And he actually got his medical doctorate in 1570 from the University of Basel.
Impressive. But even with all these different paths, he never really let go of those philosophical questions that had always been bugging him, huh?
Nope, not at all. They just kept bubbling up.
Which brings us to, I guess what's considered his most important philosophical work.
You're talking about The Triumph of Philosophy, right?
Yeah, The Triumph of Philosophy.
Yeah, it came out in 1573. And it's like, it was his big attempt at, like, a grand synthesis.
Big.
He was trying to create this whole unified framework to explain both philosophical and theological truths.
Ambitious much.
Super ambitious. And, he was really aiming to, like, give a philosophical grounding to the Christian doctrine of creation.
Which, thinking about it, it's kind of ironic that despite like his obviously religious
That
intention.
was super devout.
Yeah, and even though he published it with a really well-known academic press at the time.
The Henrik Petri Press.
Yeah, that one. He actually got a lot of pushback for the book.
Yeah, a lot of opposition. It really hurt his early academic career, sadly.
It's funny how often that happens, right? Like you try to bridge different areas of thought and then
Everyone freaks out.
exactly. So what happened to him after that? Did he like give up on academia?
Not at all. He kept at it. In 1579, he got a professorship in ethics at the University of Basel.
Basel again.
Yep, back to Basel.
Okay.
And then just a year later, he moved to the University of Altdorf. Got a professorship there in natural philosophy and medicine.
So back to his medical roots.
Yeah, kind of. And during this time, he wrote a bunch of stuff related to his teaching, including this big work on like medical predictions,
Yeah.
prognostics.
Agnostics.
Yeah, and he also put together this edited collection of writings by this medieval physician named Arnoldus of Villanova.
Yeah.
Put in his own annotations and everything.
So like really getting into the historical texts too.
Oh, yeah, for sure. But then, eventually he got back to writing more explicitly philosophical stuff.
He couldn't stay away from it for too long, huh?
No way. In 1586, you put out this critical commentary on Aristotle's On Generation and Corruption.
I guess that's where we can really start to see those philosophical interests coming back full force.
Absolutely. And then he followed that up with this concise overview of Aristotelian metaphysics.
Okay.
And a few years later, he went head-to-head with this guy named Andreas Cisalpino with this huge critique of his Averroistic philosophy.
Ah, Cisalpino. Wasn't he getting pretty popular at Altdorf around that time?
Oh, yeah, his ideas were really taking hold there.
Mm-hmm.
But Taurellus wasn't having any of it.
That sounds like a philosophical showdown. But let's maybe save that story for a bit later. Keep going with his works.
Okay, yeah. So towards the end of his life, he also published this whole trilogy.
Trilogy.
Yeah, 3 works. Cosmology, Uranology, and On the Eternity of Things. He was really digging into the whole cosmological debate happening at the time.
Especially the views of Francesco Piccolomini, right?
Yeah, he was grappling with Piccolomini's ideas. And we also have this dissertation of his from 1604 on the origin of rational souls.
That one sounds particularly relevant to our deep dive today.
Oh, definitely. And, it's almost like a little footnote, but Taurellus was also a poet.
A poet.
Yeah, he even wrote some emblems, those symbolic pictures with poems that were popular in the Renaissance.
Oh, right. Emblems. I vaguely remember learning about those.
Sadly, his life got cut short. He died from the plague in 1606. Only 58.
That's a real shame. He was obviously a brilliant guy. Okay, so let's finally dive into this whole immaterialism thing. Like, how does a philosopher who knows Aristotle so well end up saying that matter, actual stuff, doesn't exist?
Right. So like many of his contemporaries, Taurellus starts off with the 4 elements.
Earth, water, air, fire.
Yep. Those are the basic building blocks of the world.
Okay.
But then he goes and makes this really radical move. He rejects the idea of prime matter.
Prime matter? That's like...
It's the traditional Aristotelian idea that there's this like formless passive stuff that underlies everything.
Right. Like the stuff that forms act upon to make, well, stuff.
Exactly. The traditional view, which philosophers call hylomorphism.
Hylomorphism.
It's from the Greek words for matter and form.
Okay.
Anyway, hylomorphism says that everything in the world is made up of these 2 basic things, form and prime matter.
So the form gives something its specific, like, characteristics.
Yeah, and its activity is what it does.
And the prime matter is just this kind of, like, potential stuff that can take on any form.
Yeah, like a blank slate almost.
Okay, I think I remember this from, like, Philosophy 101. But
Yeah.
how did Taurellus move away from this?
Well, a lot of people back then, they thought that to explain how things change, you needed these 2 separate principles.
Yeah.
Like you had active powers that caused change and passive capacities to undergo change. And they thought these had to be opposites, like fundamentally different.
Right, because something needs to, like, be there to be changed.
Exactly. But Taurellus, he questioned that whole idea. He challenged this idea that active and passive properties are, like, really contrary to each other.
So how did he do that?
Well, he argued, and this is a quote from him, "Nothing takes on its contrary, but rather cedes when the contrary comes, but passivity increases with the increase of activity."
Whoa, that's kind of a mouthful. What does that even mean?
Think about it like this. If you have a dark room, right, and you turn on a light,
Okay, I'm with you.
the darkness doesn't, like, absorb the light and become light itself.
No, it just disappears.
Right. And another example, if you, like, exercise a muscle, you're increasing its activity,
Right.
but that doesn't make it less likely to get tired, which is a kind of passivity.
Actually, working out makes it more likely to get tired, at least in the short term.
Exactly. So for Taurellus, activity and passivity, they weren't fundamentally opposed. They could both come from the same source.
And that source being?
Form.
Mm-hmm.
He basically said, matter plainly does not exist, and nothing but forms can be and can enter composition.
Whoa. So no matter at all.
Nope. And he also rethought the whole idea of composition. For him, it wasn't this, like, mixing of matter and form to create something new.
So what was it then?
It was more like things just coming together but not really changing. He called it a mere conjunction of forms that in no way changes them.
That's a pretty different picture of, well, how things are made.
It is. And it leads to some pretty surprising consequences.
Like what?
Well, if all composition is just this, accidental joining of forms, than a human being, for example.
Which we usually think of as like one thing.
Right, one unified being.
Yeah.
Well, for Taurellus, a human being is actually just a bunch of different forms coming together.
Like, I'm not one me.
Not in the traditional sense, no. More like a temporary collection of forms without this single underlying substance.
Okay, I'll admit that's a little hard to wrap my head around. It kind of goes against, like, our basic experience.
It definitely challenges traditional notions of what it means to be a substance.
But hold on, I thought you said he didn't completely get rid of the idea of matter.
Oh, you're right, he didn't. It's just that he reinterpreted it, fit it into his immaterialist framework.
Okay, so how did that work?
One way he did this was through this idea of, like, a hierarchy of forms.
A hierarchy.
Yeah, he thought some forms were, like, nobler than others.
Nobler.
More powerful, more active. And these less noble forms, they could act as a kind of subject for the nobler ones.
Okay, I think I'm following. So when he talks about, like, bodies and stuff, the matter he's talking about is really just these less noble forms.
Exactly. It's not some fundamental stuff like in traditional hylomorphism. It's more like a relative term. Something is matter in relation to a more active form acting on it.
So matter isn't a thing in itself. It's more like a level in a hierarchy.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Uh-huh.
And for Taurellus, this hierarchy of forms, it explained how change happened in the world.
How so?
Well, the less noble form, it's more likely to undergo change.
Because it's more passive.
Yeah. And the nobler form, it's more likely to cause change.
Okay, that makes sense.
And this whole relationship between the forms, for Taurellus, that was the basis of efficient causation, like how one thing makes another thing happen. And it also explained where natural forces come from. He said, and I quote, "Nature is the unique principle of corporeal things and consists in a single substance, not in two or three substances. This substance seems to be manifold because it expresses itself in various forces."
So he's basically saying that everything in the world comes from this one substance, but it appears as many different things because of the different forces at play.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about those forms and how they interact.
Okay, that's starting to make more sense. But
Yeah.
what about prime matter, like in the traditional sense?
Yeah.
Completely formless, pure potential stuff. Does that have any place in Taurellus's system?
So he does use the term prime matter, but in a very specific way. And it's totally tied to his theology.
Okay, tell me more.
He uses it as a kind of metaphor for the nothing, like with capital letters.
The nothing.
Yeah. It's how he conceptualizes the absolute non-existence that existed before God created the world. The whole creation ex nihilo thing.
Oh, right, creation out of nothing.
Exactly. So for Taurellus, prime matter isn't actually part of the created world.
Okay, I'm with you.
It's just a way of thinking about what wasn't there before creation.
Interesting. So for Taurellus, reality is basically built out of these immaterial forms, right?
Yep, all interacting and organized in this complex hierarchy.
Which naturally leads to questions about, well, substance.
Right, like what does it even mean to be a substance if there's no matter?
Yeah, exactly. And how does that whole immaterialism thing tie into his understanding of, like, creation and the relationship between God and the world?
Right, so this is where things get really interesting, especially for those who are, like, into the philosophical side of theology.
Hit me with it.
So for Taurellus, creation and the relationship between God and the world are super important. He was really grappling with this question of how creatures can be connected to God, but also distinct.
Connected, but separate.
Yeah, exactly. He said, since an infinite substance fills out everything, nothing can be separated from it. So for him, God is everywhere.
Okay, but if God is, like, everywhere and in everything, how do we maintain our own, like, individual identity? How are we not just part of God?
Right. So that's exactly the tension that Taurellus is trying to work out. And he says that the difference between us and God, it's not that God isn't in us or that we aren't in God, but that our substances are different.
Our substances are different.
Yep. And what this implies is that creatures have to have their own genuine substantiality. Like they have to be real substances in their own right.
And that's where his critique of that traditional view of substance, holomorphism, comes in, right?
You got it. Taurellus really didn't like this idea that maybe creatures were so connected to God that they couldn't exist without like this constant act of divine sustenance.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. So he was worried that that view would basically collapse everything into God, right? Like there'd only be one substance God and everything else would just be like a modification of God.
Yep, that's substance monism. And he thought it was problematic for a few reasons.
Okay, like what?
Well, first, he thought it was absurd to say that God, who's infinite and unchanging, could have finite changing accidents. He said, the absurdity cannot be avoided that an infinite substance will be defined by finite accidents.
Right, because accidents are like temporary and limited, and God is, well, not.
Exactly. And second, he thought that if creatures were just modifications of God, then it might mean that they could, like, perfect God.
Perfect God, how so?
Well, he thought that if our actions were just God's actions, then that would mean our actions could make God more perfect. And he quotes this line, "It would follow that we are the perfection of the substance of God, because actions perfect the substance from which they proceed." But he believed God is already absolutely perfect.
So no need for improvement from us. Okay, so how do his immaterial forms help him avoid all this? How do they make space for creatures to be their own substances?
Well, remember how in traditional hylomorphism, prime matter is considered accidental?
Yeah.
Taurellus thought that was a problem. He said, want matter, which is nothing by itself, to be something accidentally.
Right, because if prime matter is nothing on its own, how can it even be an accident?
Right. And he also pointed out that traditional hylomorphism says that forms can't exist without matter.
Yeah, they need something to inform, right?
Right. He quoted this line, "Natural forms cannot subsist without a subject. If this were admitted, they would not be substances but accidents." So he thought that both of those things meant that hylomorphism couldn't really explain how creatures were truly substances.
Okay, so he's saying the traditional view doesn't actually give creatures their own being?
Yep, and he also pointed out this big logical problem with how prime matter and form depend on each other in the traditional view.
Uh-oh, what's that?
So if neither one can exist without the other,
Right.
then you end up with this really weird conclusion. He says that the effect is, in this case, its own cause.
The effect is its own cause.
Yeah, it's a contradiction.
Yeah.
He's saying that form is supposed to give matter its essence, right?
Right.
But the form itself can't exist without matter. So it depends on matter for its existence.
Okay.
And then matter is nothing without form, right?
Right.
So it depends on the form, which is its effect, for its own existence. It's this circular dependency.
I see. So it's like a chicken and egg situation, but even weirder.
Right. And this is where Taurellus's immaterial forms come in to save the day.
They break the cycle.
Exactly.
Right.
Because they don't depend on matter for their existence. They can be real substances on their own.
Okay, that makes sense. So he's saying that creatures can exist as these independent forms, but what about creation itself? Does God still have a role?
Oh, absolutely. He's not saying God isn't the creator. He's just saying that once God creates something, it can exist on its own. It doesn't need, like, God's constant attention to keep existing.
So it's not like God is constantly holding everything together.
Right. He's more like a watchmaker who builds a watch that can then run on its own.
Got it. So what about living things? How did Taurellus use these immaterial forms to explain, plants and animals and stuff?
This is another area where his thinking gets really interesting.
Lay it on me.
Okay, so he definitely considered that whole traditional theological view, that God directly creates each individual soul.
Right.
But he wasn't totally convinced, especially when it came to explaining, like, imperfections in the world.
Because how could a perfect God create a world with imperfections?
Exactly. So he started leaning towards this more naturalistic explanation for how souls come about.
Naturalistic.
Yeah, meaning that it's based on, like, natural processes, not just a direct act of God.
Oh, interesting. So how did he explain that?
Well, this is where his teacher, Jacob Czech, comes back into the picture. Remember him? The Aristotelian scholar.
Oh, right.
Well, Scheck was really into this ancient philosopher Alexander of Aphrodisias.
Alexander of Aphrodisias.
Yeah, he was a big commentator on Aristotle. And he had this view that the soul wasn't just like a mixture of the elements.
Okay, so it wasn't just like earth, air, fire, and water coming together to make a soul.
Right. He thought it was more like a power that emerges from a specific mixture of elements.
Emerges like it's something new that comes out of the combination.
Exactly. Alexander said that the soul is a power and form which supervenes through such a mixture upon the temperament of bodies, and it is not a proportion or composition of the temperament.
Supervenes?
It means like it arises from the combination, but it's not reducible to just the sum of its parts.
Oh, okay. So the soul is like something totally new and different that comes from the elements, but it's not just the elements themselves.
Right. Modern scholars like Victor Kasten, they see this as a kind of emergentism.
Emergentism.
Yeah, basically the idea that when certain things come together, they can create something totally new with new causal powers.
Causal powers, like the ability to make things happen.
Exactly.
Okay, so how does this relate to Taurellus?
Well, Taurellus had a similar idea about how new forms emerge when things come together. He said, when by mutual action and passion mixed, things are changed in such a way that none of them remains entirely the same, but some new form arises out of it that related to the forces of all of them.
So he's saying that when things interact, they can create a new form that has the powers of all the things that came before.
That's the gist of it, yeah. And he used this idea to explain both plant and animal life.
So how did that work?
Well, he reserved the terms soul and life mainly for animals.
Because they can, like, sense things and move around on their own?
Exactly. But he saw a similar kind of emergence happening in both plants and animals, like the right materials coming together to create a new form.
So even though plants don't have souls in the same way animals do?
They still have these substantial forms with causal powers, like they can grow and reproduce and stuff.
And these forms, they're more than just the elements themselves, right?
Right, there's something new. And for animals, Taurellus thought that the soul was what gave the body its specific properties, like being able to move and sense things.
So it's like a two-way street. The soul gives life to the body, but the body also influences the soul.
Yep, he even called it a circle of causation. The soul's vitality is communicated to the body, but the body's actions also perfect the soul.
Wow. So it's like this constant interplay between the soul and the body.
Exactly. And get this, he even applied this idea to human souls. He said the human soul by itself is capable of ceasing to be.
Wait, so he's saying that the human soul could potentially, like, die?
Yeah, without divine intervention, like resurrection. That was a pretty bold claim for a Lutheran theologian in the 16th century.
That's definitely a very different view of the soul than we usually hear about. Okay, so earlier you mentioned Taurellus's critique of Andreas Cisalpino and his worries about substance monism. Can we circle back to that? What was the main point of disagreement there?
Sure. So Taurellus was really concerned with these philosophical systems that kind of blurred the line between God and creation.
Like making them too much the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. And he thought Cisalpino was doing that.
Cisalpino, the guy who was getting popular at Altdorf.
Yep, that's the one. He was following Averroes, who had this idea about a single intellect for all humans. But Cisalpino took it even further.
How so?
Well, he said there was this single, self-reflecting soul, the active intellect, that animated like everything, all humans, all animals, even the whole world.
Whoa, that's a pretty big claim.
It is. Taurellus even quotes him, saying that Cisalpino believes in a single soul that exists by itself and is multiplied according to the bodies of living beings.
So like one universal soul that shows up differently in different bodies.
Yep, basically.
Okay, so what was Taurellus's problem with this?
Well, he thought it basically meant that God was part of creation, like a constituent cause.
A constituent cause.
Yeah, like one of the ingredients that make things what they are. But Taurellus believed God was just the efficient cause, the one who brings things into being.
Okay, I see. So he's saying that for Cisalpino, God is actually in the stuff of the universe.
Exactly. And Taurellus thought that led to substance monism. Like there's only one substance God and everything else is just like a variation of that.
Right, right. And didn't Cisalpino try to like explain how individual minds could exist if there's only one universal intellect?
Oh yeah, he did. He said that this universal intellect could like temporarily split its consciousness to create the experience of individual minds.
Oh, okay.
But Taurellus wasn't buying it.
What did he say to that?
He came up with some pretty clever arguments against it.
Like what?
Well, he used this analogy of a moving stone.
A moving stone.
Yeah, he said if individual minds were just like parts of this one big universal intellect, then their activity should be basically the same as the whole.
Like if I'm thinking something, you should be able to know it.
Exactly. But we obviously don't experience that.
Yeah. Thankfully, I like my privacy.
Right. And then he had this other analogy with a clock.
A claw.
Yeah, he pointed out that we think of the different parts of a clock as separate things.
Yeah.
Because they all have their own functions.
Okay, yeah.
And he said it's the same with minds. The fact that we can't access each other's thoughts, that suggests we are actually separate substances, not just modifications of one big mind.
Those are some pretty good analogies, I get it. Were there any other problems Taurellus had with Cisalpino's ideas?
Yeah, he also had a problem with how Cisalpino explained the dependence of the material world on God.
Okay.
It seemed like Cisalpino was saying that only living beings, like things with souls, really depended on God.
But not like rocks and stuff.
Right. And Taurellus thought that contradicted the doctrine of creation.
Because God created everything, right? Not just living things.
Yeah, exactly. He even quotes Cisalpino as saying, neither prime matter nor secondary matter, that is, a body that is not animate, depends on the first being. He's basically saying that inanimate stuff doesn't depend on God for its existence.
Yeah, I see the problem with that.
Right. And Taurellus also disagreed with Cisalpino on this whole question of necessity.
Necessity.
Yeah, like whether things have to.